It's a special bonus episode of OPB Politics Now for Monday, June 26th. After 6 months and one furious weekend of work, the Oregon Legislature has adjourned for the year. Now it's time for lawmakers to vacation and for our weary crew of journalists to judge them. I'm Anna Griffin. I'm an editor at OPB.
I'm OPB Politics reporter Lauren Dake.
And I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
So while you two were busy working this weekend watching legislators finish, I was looking back at all the things they said they were going to do during this biennial-long session. Let's start this episode by comparing what they said were their priorities and what they actually got done. First, housing. People in both parties said going into the session that housing and homelessness were the biggest challenges facing Oregon. New Governor Tina Kotek kicked off her administration by declaring a housing state of emergency and calling on lawmakers to help her increase production by 80% over current levels. So, 6 months of work. What did Oregon's legislature actually accomplish on housing?
Well, this feels like a really long time ago now, but at the start of the session, like you said, lawmakers were actually on the same page about really what they believed to be the biggest problems facing the state and therefore the top priorities, and that was the housing crisis. And at the beginning, especially, they did a lot. They passed a $200 million housing package that should help cities build more affordable housing. It earmarks money specifically for rural parts of the state. It also tries to shift the state toward being more proactive and just smarter when it comes to building. So it requires cities with populations greater than 10,000 people to set building targets for specific income levels and then build the actual number of affordable housing units that they think are necessary. That seems kind of obvious, but it has not been done before. So lawmakers, they did a lot on housing. They also put a cap on rent control, and they put some money in eviction prevention service programs. But one thing I want to mention here is a little bit of intrigue that happened yesterday, Sunday, late afternoon. Lawmakers considered this bill that would have made it a lot easier for cities to expand the urban growth boundary. Basically, it would have let them almost unilaterally make these decisions that are often lengthy and often litigious. And that bill is a really big priority for Governor Tina Kotek because it would help the state reach these ambitious building goals. So yesterday, Sunday, at the end of session, the bill came up for a floor vote in the Senate and it failed. And that's really rare in the first place. But it failed because Democrats voted against it. Arguably, if more conservative lawmakers had been on the floor, it could have passed. So then we heard that the governor was making rounds in the hallways of the Capitol, sort of trying to secretly strong-arm Democratic lawmakers into changing their vote right before the session adjourned. But in the end, that didn't happen, and I suspect we'll see that measure come up again next session.
Lauren, how would you characterize what they did? How much of this is going to result in short-term fixes, people actually noticing, say, fewer tents in Portland and its suburbs versus longer term, we all have to be a little patient?
I think the money, the infusion of cash from the $200 million housing package should make a difference relatively soon. Some of that is going to go to these nonprofits that are already on the ground doing a lot of work that will, help move people into more stable housing and off the streets. That's the goal anyway.
Dirk, let's look at another priority for lawmakers. Back in January, they talked about improving the state's behavioral health system. We're talking behavioral health encompasses both mental health care and addiction services. What progress did they make?
They took some solid steps. I mean, probably the biggest news in this area was a new tax lawmakers passed to fund the 988 hotline for people in crisis. It's this new national resource. So this is a tax on phone lines. It's 40 cents a month per line. And advocates in the mental health community are thrilled by this. They think it's going to sort of change the game in terms of getting people in crisis someone to talk to at all hours of the day. Very easily, all anyone has to do is hit 988 on their phone. The money is also going to fund some response services around the state. But one reason why this is especially notable, Anna, is that, as you know, Democrats lost the ability to pass taxes on their own in last year's election. They no longer have the 3/5 majorities needed to do that. So they needed at least one Republican vote in both chambers to pass this thing. And they got it in part because this tax was part of the deal reached to end the GOP walkout in the Senate. Democrats gave up a lot, but they also secured, apparently, the votes for this to pass. Beyond that 988 tax, the legislature made some tweaks to Measure 110, which is the law that decriminalized user amounts of drugs in the state. Most of those were just to make it easier for the state to get money to treatment services, but lawmakers did also create misdemeanor consequences for people who are caught with moderate amounts of fentanyl. Obviously, fentanyl is a big problem, and strangely, there was not that criminal consequence on the books before. And the legislature also passed an opioid package that will see the overdose reversal drug naloxone become far more accessible to the public.
So they did make tweaks to Measure 110. Are we done talking about whether that works yet?
You know what? Republicans really want to talk about whether that works. They want to roll back the decriminalization. And in fact, recent polling suggests that the majority of Oregonians are with them. They are kind of freaked out by what they're seeing. I think we should be careful about causality and correlation about why what folks are seeing is about or isn't about Measure 110, but the public does seem to be turning against it. What Democrats have said is they want to give this system more time to mature, to get the services and money out to the state, and let's have a more considered picture of whether it's working or not. So I think it's possible we see ballot action or something in the future, but for now, Democrats are trying to fine-tune this thing and give it a chance to work.
So no, we're not done talking about it.
Not right now. I can't.
Here's another one from the wish list back in the winter. Solving the state's public defense crisis. Did the legislature do that?
No, we did not. Since the pandemic, this problem of Oregon having too few public defenders to meet the need has only increased, so much so that currently there are hundreds of people in jail who don't have lawyers, to say nothing of the far more people outside of jail who don't have lawyers. There are a lot of people, I think, who feel this situation is only going to be solved by a major shift in how the state handles public defense. Currently, Oregon doesn't actually employ the majority of its public defenders. It holds contracts with outside groups and attorneys who do that work. That's going to start to change under a bill lawmakers passed this year. The state is going to begin transitioning to hiring more defenders as state employees. And alongside that, maybe more meaningfully, I think the state is going to begin paying public defenders more. That's something obviously necessary to not only retain people to do this work, but to recruit people to do this work. And lawmakers found themselves relatively flush with cash this year. They passed a budget that includes around $100 million more for public defense. Now, I don't think that fixes it. I'm not sure exactly how far it gets us, but we are going to wait and see what kinds of impacts these changes have.
As you mentioned, Democrats no longer have the supermajorities they need to pass tax increases without Republican help, but they did come into this session with majorities in both chambers and promising to spend time strengthening Oregon's already pretty quite unique protections for abortion access. What did they get done on that?
Right. They introduced this bill, House Bill 2002, the one that spurred the legislative walkout. And the measure, it does a lot. Foremost, it protects medical providers from prosecution if they provide an abortion to people traveling from an anti-abortion state. It also expands insurance coverage to include laser hair removal or facial surgery for people seeking gender-affirming care. But the part of the measure that spurred Republicans to boycott the Senate for 6 weeks really centered on parental rights. So the way that the bill was originally drafted, it would have made it very clear that minors under the age of 15 did not need a parent's permission to have an abortion. And Republicans really felt like this was just an affront to parents' rights. So as part of the deal to bring them back to the building, Democrats agreed to keep in place a legal requirement that parental permission is required for children under the age of 15 or minors under the age of 15 to end a pregnancy. But that requirement can be overridden if healthcare providers determine that telling the parents would harm the child. Also part of the deal, Democrats agreed to cut out portions of the bill that would have expanded abortion access on university campuses and in rural parts of the state. So really, in the end, the bill still does a lot, but Democrats got rid of some significant provisions.
Democrats and Republicans both vowed to take steps this year to improve the state economy, most notably pushing through a package aimed at helping Oregon compete for federal money to support expansions in the semiconductor industry. What passed, and what are our chances of getting that federal money and the jobs that presumably would come with it?
So this is another one of those that feels like 3 years ago at this point. This is a beginning of session topic before the walkouts and the brinksmanship and people possibly forfeiting their legislative careers. But back then, there was this very civil and productive discussion, if you can imagine it, about how to bolster Oregon's semiconductor industry. And that took, I think, two basic forms. The first was that lawmakers carved out more than $200 million that can go to semiconductor companies in Oregon who want to pursue big new projects. The thinking being that state money is going to help those companies compete for far larger amounts of money available under the Federal CHIPS Act. And actually, lawmakers decided late in session to put another $50 million toward that purpose, since it turned out they had a lot more to spend than they knew about in April. The other big thing they did was more controversial. They gave Governor Tina Kotek the authority to unilaterally change urban growth boundaries, those lines Lauren was talking about earlier around cities, in order to bring in industrial land that might be necessary for a big semiconductor project. I think right now, to your second question, Anna, it's not really clear what all this means for Oregon. We don't know a ton about actual projects vying for federal money. I think we'll need more clarity on that before we know what chances the state has. We can say that the Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, visited the state earlier this year. Her agency is awarding these funds, and she seemed genuinely impressed by some of the steps the state was taking. So that is potentially a good sign.
Let's close the loop on urban growth boundaries, because it's come up twice in this conversation. So the legislature essentially, tell me if I'm wrong here, Dirk, gave the governor more power to expand them in specific cases where it would lead to more industrial growth, did not give cities the power to expand for housing needs. Is that a fair summary?
That's right. Yeah. And there was actually a very interesting moment early in the session where Kotek was asked about this ability she would have to expand UGBs for industrial land. And she said, well, that's fine. I'd love to have the ability, though, to do that for housing. And so fast forward 3 months or whatever it is, she has a bill she's pushing that wouldn't give her the ability solo to expand these things, but would give cities a lot more free rein to expand their boundaries, to expand their UGBs and bring in more housing. Kind of the same thing Kotek wanted, but it was a far tougher sell with Dems. That's partly because they just really were concerned about further rolling back these sacrosanct land use laws. But they also, I think, were listening to planners and people who advocate for those laws who say, actually, roping in that new land isn't the thing we really need. There's actual land. There are just other steps we need to take. So super interesting dynamics on that issue.
Thank you for this very nerdy digression. I appreciate it, Dirk. You know that. Lauren, on the more progressive side, lawmakers promised tougher gun safety laws in the wake of even more mass shootings. Did the liberal Democrats in Salem get what they were seeking this year?
Well, they managed to ban ghost guns. Those are the guns that are untraceable and that people can make on their own and purchase online. And so, yeah, that is a big deal. They also had hoped to increase the age to purchase guns from 18 to 21 years old, and they had hoped to give cities the chance to ban concealed weapons in public buildings if they wanted to. But those also became part of the negotiations to end the walkout in order to convince Republicans to come back. Democrats got rid of the components to raise the age and allow cities to ban concealed weapons. Yesterday, Senate Democratic leader Kate Lieber told reporters that she hopes Democrats can start a work group during the interim and take a closer look at suicide by gun and have both parties at the table to see if they can't make some headway on the other fronts in the interim.
Thanks. Dirk, lawmakers promised this year, and here's where you should cue the trumpets, they were going to take firm steps to protect democracy and improve public trust in elections. I have goosebumps just saying those words. Did they do that?
They would definitely say yes. I think there were some notable changes to state elections infrastructure this year that includes, stiffer criminal penalties for people that harass elections workers. There was an expansion of the state's motor voter law. People probably know that currently Oregonians who interact with the DMV are automatically registered to vote. That same mechanism could soon be coming to people who sign up for the Oregon Health Plan, the state's version of Medicaid, though that's going to involve some federal permissions that have yet to be granted. But you will not be surprised, Anna, and maybe this is part of your sarcastic trumpets, to hear that Democrats once again let one major priority slip, which is setting campaign contribution limits. Remember, Oregon is currently one of just a few states that have no limits on political giving. As they always do, Democrats came into the session sort of touting campaign finance reform as among their goals in this lofty democratic values section of their goals. But we really actually saw notably no action. There was not a single hearing that I can recall on a campaign finance bill, partly because people in the Capitol are sort of frozen in place with how they feel about this issue. As House Speaker Dan Rayfield will often say, they just don't change how they feel about it. So conversations can only go so far. That has been a real stumbling block for getting anything across in the session. We certainly saw that this year. And I think the upshot is this is increasingly likely to be something advocacy groups put on the ballot, and maybe voters go with one of those proposals.
Finally, lawmakers in both parties entered the 2023 session with what you described way back when in our legislative preview as, and I do hesitate to say this even out loud, optimism. Way back on January 16th, Lauren, I think you wrote, I'm quoting here, legislative leaders from both parties nodded to previous dysfunction and said they hope this session is done differently. How'd that work out for everybody?
Well, I'll jump in here first because, yes, I remember writing that story. I also remember noting on the podcast at the time that most sessions do start out with an optimistic note, but clearly that does not always happen. Here's why they were optimistic. They agreed on the big priorities. They wanted to get the big housing package through. They did that. They wanted to pass a bill that would make it easier to attract semiconductor business to the state. They did that. At the same time, there were real red flags. We had new leadership in every chamber, in every caucus, and the leaders they did not have the kind of trust that maybe would have allowed them to navigate some of these more controversial bills. And that is where we saw the real breakdown. Yesterday, after they adjourned, I asked Senate President Rob Wagner, what would you have done differently? And he didn't really answer the question, but he said something about he was looking forward to working in the interim, to building some relationships, to putting on a t-shirt and jeans and visiting people's districts. And I think that was an acknowledgement that the mistrust between him and the Senate Republican leader, Tim Knopp, really did factor into the boycott and the breakdown and the dysfunction.
I would point to another story we wrote, though, which was our story halfway through the session that said, lawmakers have done a lot of work on housing, a lot of work on semiconductors, but now the harder fights are coming. That wasn't necessarily our psychic abilities. That was very clear, but I don't think either of us knew at the time just how hard those fights would get. I certainly did not expect the longest walkout in state history or 10 lawmakers opting to end their Senate careers. So I guess I just think it's going to be very interesting to see what comes out of the walkout in the months to come. We are expecting at least one lawsuit. There is jockeying about actually what the measure 113 that could see these people getting booted out of the Senate actually means. We're waiting for clarity on that. And there's just also no way that this session doesn't have ripple effects on coming legislative sessions, most pressingly next year's legislative session. So I really do expect the 2023 session to be the gift that keeps on giving, probably in some unfortunate ways.
Thank you both for your work. I hope you take a nap before you have to cover all that.
Me too.
That's it for this week's episode of OPB Politics Now. As usual, we come to you from the Gert Boyle studio at OPB. Nalene Silva is our audio engineer. Our music is from Audio Network. We'll be back later this week with our regular Friday episode, though hopefully by that point, Dirk and Lauren will indeed be taking naps. In the meantime, you can find all of our coverage of the 2023 legislative session and everything else we do at opb.org. One more important thing you can do on our website: become a sustaining member of OPB. It is the single best way to support all the journalism reporters like these two do every day. Thank you for your support, and thanks for listening.